Kia ora everyone, it's really great to have you here at today's very exciting online session with School Strike for Climate and Climate Change Commissioners Dr. Rod Carr and Lisa Tumahai. Ko Charlie Keeling aho. I'm a Senior Advisor in the Communications and Engagement team and I'll be running this session today. But first, we're really happy to have our team member Bevan Hunter lead us into this session with a karakia. Kia ora, Bevan.
Kia ora tātou, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou I runga I te pāka whakaata a reo nei. Poipoia te Māori, poipoia te Wairua, poipoia te tapu, poipoia te whenua o Papatuanuku. Hati hei Māori ora. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Kia ora, Bevan, thank you. So to start us off, before I tell you a little bit more about what we've been up to at the Commission, it would be really great if you could please write your name and the school or your university you're attending or which organisation you're at and write one word to describe how you're feeling about climate change. Since we can't see your faces, it's really awesome to see who we've got on the call with us today. And while you're doing that, I'll give you a quick update on what we've been up to here at the Commission. So we released our first draft package of advice outlining what Aotearoa could do to reach its climate goals at the end of January. And on the 1st of February, consultation on our draft advice opened to the public. So that means until the 14th of March, New Zealanders are welcome to look at what we're recommending the government needs to do to tackle climate change and tell us what they think about our mahi. I know that School Strike for Climate have been doing some really great things to make our advice more accessible to young people and enable people to make a submission, which I'm sure they'll tell you more about soon. But I just wanted to note that we're really open to making changes to our advice to government on the back of what we're hearing from you all during the next 6 weeks. So to give you a bit more information about how today is going to work, we have School Strike for Climate National representatives Ethan and Kelly joining us today. Ethan's also School Strike's media representative, so he's used to speaking to a wider audience. Thank you for taking the time out of your school day to join us. I'm sure the work of School Strike needs no introduction, but both here in Aotearoa and around the world, they've been making a huge difference to how we collectively address climate change. School Strike is just one of several groups that has led to action on climate change becoming a reality. So it's a big privilege to have them here on this call and to hear what they have to say. From the Climate Change Commission, we have our expert commissioners, Chair of the Commission, Dr. Rod Carr, and Deputy Chair, Lisa Tumahai. They're going to give us an overview of the work we've been doing here and how the Commission has considered young people in our advice to government. So we'll split this hour roughly into 2 sections, the first of which we'll hear a bit more from our panellists before giving you the opportunity to ask questions. As I said before, we're really keen to hear from you and answer some of your questions. So if there's anything you want to ask during the session, please pop it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. During the second half of the session, we're going to hear from School Strike for Climate on some of their top climate change issues, and Lisa and Rod will be given the chance to respond to each one. We'll have more time for questions at the end, and if you want to use the chat during this session, you're more than welcome to. We encourage conversation. So I think that's enough from me. It's time to introduce our panellists properly, and I'm going to come to each of you individually and ask you to very briefly tell us how you got involved with climate change. So we'll start with you, Kelly. Kia ora.
Kia ora everyone, thanks for having me. I'm Kelly, my pronouns are she, her. I grew up in a really big city where much denser than Wellington, and it was really, really visible, the wealth difference. You could see, the rich to the rich and poorest to the poor. And growing up, I could see that people living in the same block as me struggled with really, really simple things that I've never thought of. And that, I think, brought about my interest in climate change, specifically climate justice. I'm not in this necessarily for myself. I'm in this for the people who aren't as fortunate as I am. Because, I have a house to live in. I'm probably going to get a decent job when I'm older. And there are so many people who are less fortunate than that. And that's how I got into climate activism.
Thank you, Kelly. That was great. I'll go over to Rod now. Kia ora, Rod.
Kia ora. Mine was quite simple. I was very late to climate science, climate policy and climate action, and can date it pretty accurately to about August, just over a year ago. So I was asked whether I would be interested in putting my name forward to chair the Climate Change Commission. And I was sitting around at the dinner table with our children who are in their 20s and one in their early 30s, and was saying, I've had this approach. It would be quite busy. They want me to spend time in Wellington, and I have these other commitments. And my youngest son, who's 26, who's done a Bachelor of Engineering with honours in software engineering and a BSc in ecology and animal behaviour, said, well, Dad, you can quit all your other jobs. This is the only one that matters. So when your kids tell you what you should do with your retirement, it made me interested enough to say yes. And I've spent the last 15 months learning more about climate science, climate policy, and climate action than I would have ever thought I could have not known, and asked myself where I've been for the last 30 years. But it's a privilege to be chairing the commission, and this is a particular milestone that we have a body of work out for your consultation. I phrase it slightly differently when I say in 2050, when my grandkids, who are now 1 and 5, ask me, so Granddad, what did you do once you knew how much damage you were causing? I want to be able to say I did all I could, but I wish I'd known sooner. Kia ora.
That's great, Rod. Thank you. Lisa, I'll hand over to you now.
Kia ora koutou. It's a pleasure to spend some time with you today. So my journey with climate change, I come from a little town, Hokitika, west coast of the South Island. So we have a really large tribal area, and 87% of the tribal area that I come from is in conservation estate. So I come from a hapu who have worked with industries on the west coast, whether it's mining, agriculture, tourism, forestry, been working with those industries for many, many, many years in terms of trying to ensure that they are operating in a sustainable way, that they're protecting our environment as best that they can. And if they're not, then hopefully doing something about that. Being on the governance board of the iwi of Ngāitahu, we have a whakatauki, a proverb that is mō tātou a mō ka uri a muri aki nei, and that means for us as decision makers, it means the decisions we make today are for us that are living today and our children living today, but they're also for the children yet to come and the children after them. So we take an extremely long-term vision in our decision making about the things that we're doing. Those decisions are becoming scrutinised more tightly now that we have a climate change strategy, an iwi climate change strategy. We launched it in 2018, but it was actually about 6 years of work to get to that climate change strategy. And now the challenge is to implement it. And that really raised an awareness for not just myself, but for our iwi of what's ahead of us if we don't start to take action. And if we're true to the proverb, if we're going to live up to those things, then we've got to do our part and take action. So we're on a journey for that. We're not where I'd like us to be 2 years into the strategy. COVID took a bit of a hit with us, but we're on a journey, and it's one of the most critical, high priority kaupapa that we're working on as an iwi. So that's what got me here. So, kia ora.
Kia ora, that was awesome, Lisa. Thank you. Ethan, we'll round off with you.
Awesome. Kia ora, everyone. My name is Ethan, and I use he, him pronouns. I spent most of my childhood growing up in Wellington, and recently, in recent years, moved down to Oamaru, which I'm sure the majority of you can understand the attitude and the shift in that was obviously moving from what can be seen as an open-minded community to quite a conservative, smaller town that's quite farming orientated. So for me, I was actually quite lucky. I was able to be taught and be educated on the basics of climate change in primary and intermediate school up in Wellington. And so for me, when I was approached with the opportunity to join the movement and be part of School Strike, it was quite an exciting time for me, and one that I didn't want to turn down. But being in quite a conservative town, and one where we quite literally don't get taught anything about climate change, I want to be able to share my experiences and the education that I was lucky enough to be taught with the wider community. But I also want to be able to make sure that not only our generation, but not only the future generations, but the generations that are currently with us also have that opportunity. So being able to promote the use of climate education throughout the community is a huge passion of mine. And it's one that we all need to be working on to ensure that we create a fair response to this crisis that we face. But kia ora, that's me.
Thank you all. That was really great to hear a bit more about your personal experiences. So I'm just going to hand over to Rod and Lisa now to give us a brief overview of our work here at the Commission and what that means for young people. Thank you both.
Okay, let me just start very briefly, and then I will throw to Lisa. The Commission is tasked with quite a narrow scope of responsibilities. We are not all things environmental. We are not even all things climate. And the particular work which we're currently consulting on is an even narrower subset of all the things the Commission might be responsible for in time. And that is to provide the government with advice on emissions budgets. That's how much of these greenhouse gases can we emit to be on target to reach our statutory targets. So Parliament's already agreed what the targets will be. And that's a 10% reduction in biogenic methane from our 2017 levels by 2030, and a between 24 and 47% reduction in biogenic methane from 2017 by 2050, and net zero in all other long-lived gases. And by net zero, we mean all that we put up, less what is sequestered in forests, should be net zero by 2050. So those are the targets. They're already set. They've been agreed by Parliament. And then the Minister said, so what emissions budgets would be consistent in 5 yearly periods to put us on that track and keep us on that track with some confidence that we'll achieve it. And the 5 yearly periods are a budget out to 2025 for emissions, another one out to 2030, and then out to 2035. And if current policies and our behaviour as New Zealanders is not going to get us there, what's your plan? What would you recommend the government do to put us on that path, meet those budgets? And that's the emissions reduction plan. And so it's not surprising, I'm sure none of you will be surprised to know that current policy and behaviours do not put us on a pathway to achieve those domestic targets. And as a consequence, there is a plan that would require things to change in order to get the outcomes that we have already signed up to get. And that plan focuses largely on the sources of emissions. Where do our agricultural emissions come from? And it's largely biogenic methane from ruminant pastoral livestock, such as sheep and cows and dairy cattle and beef, right? And how do we think you could help farming and farmers in New Zealand? And what changes do we think are likely to happen that would help get biogenic methane levels down? And so in agriculture, we've got some advice about that. And we think there are ways without, relying on things that haven't yet been invented to meet our target for 2030 and the lowest end of our target for the 2050 for biogenic methane. Land use change, more commonly used better practices in breeding and in feeding livestock will do quite a lot of the work, as well as the water reforms, which will reduce some of the intensity of some of the agricultural activities going in some parts of New Zealand. We also, in agriculture, think of forestry, and our current policies set us up to essentially pollute and plant, and massive hectares of New Zealand will get planted in Pinus radiata. And the Commission's advice is, we don't think that's a good idea. We don't think that's sustainable. We don't think that's fair for future generations, because basically when you plant a tree, it sucks down the carbon for 30 years. but essentially when you chop it down, that carbon is likely to be released unless it's built into a building. And so you have to plant again, and basically you run out of land eventually. So our advice is we need to, yes, use some additional Pinus radiata plantations, but we need to fade that out as a source of reduction and plant quite aggressively large estates of native forest in New Zealand to be permanent sinks for those hard to abate, that's hard to get rid of, long-lived gas emissions. How we generate energy is really important in New Zealand. We talk about having 80 to 85% of all our electricity coming from renewable sources like hydro dams and low emissions geothermal fields and so forth. But actually only 40% of all of our energy comes from renewables, because we use a lot of liquid fossil fuels to drive our cars around, and we burn coal and oil and gas in order to make things in manufacturing and heat the spaces we live and work in. So our target should be to substantially increase from that 40% the use of renewable sources of energy to power our country and our lives. And so there's a plan in there for doing that as well. And that transport issue is a big one. We think New Zealanders will take up more active mobility, and that will displace some of the journeys currently travelled in high-emitting internal combustion engine vehicles. But we also think that New Zealanders need to be encouraged to acquire electric vehicles and discouraged from buying internal combustion engine cars. So there's policy advice about how we go about that as well. And then there's quite a lot of advice about how do we make sure this is inclusive? How do we make sure that in getting to a low emissions economy, we recognize that the impact of change doesn't fall evenly on everybody, that there are some communities and individuals who have very little choice, and merely increasing the price of emissions simply is a tax on their lives because they cannot avoid that activity. And in other parts of New Zealand, there may well be communities and individuals who, without any additional subsidies or incentives, can and should adopt lower emitting lifestyles in either how they heat their homes or how they get around. So that burden sharing is actually an important part of the advice from the Commission, is to make sure we have the research to inform us, we have the policies to support those communities most impacted and least able to make an adjustment. And it's not to support them to compete, to continue their high emitting activities. It is to support them so they too can transition to enjoy the benefits of a thriving, climate resilient, low emissions Aotearoa in the future. It's a vision of a cleaner, greener, healthier, less vulnerable and more sustainable country that drives the Commission's advice. And our conclusion is that there are technically feasible, economically affordable, and in our view, socially acceptable pathways for New Zealand to achieve its domestic targets for reducing emissions. That's the work of the Commission. It's open for consultation. We've got some advice there about how we think wider New Zealand communities should be involved continuously in the development of climate policy, the evaluation of climate action. So welcome to your future. It's all here now. Over to you, Lisa.
Kia ora, thanks, Rob. So to continue on from that, so how do the He Pouarangi, the Climate Commission, consider young people in our work? So climate change, it's an intergenerational and cross-system issue. So taking action to address it will require unprecedented coordination and inclusive approach, as Rod has talked to, and a step change in climate policy in Aotearoa to drive emissions reductions. So intergenerational equity is reflected in Hiara Waiora, part of the government's wellbeing framework, through the dimensions of wellbeing, the ends and the tikanga, the means, both of which are essential to intergenerational wellbeing. So this aligns closely with the concept of tiakitanga, which is what the Commission are using. The legislation, the Climate Change Response Act, that also requires us to think about intergenerational equity. So the government need to work alongside young people and ensure they are including young people, regional Aotearoa, low-income communities, Māori, Pacifica, people with disabilities, to make sure that they benefit from the opportunities and are not disproportionately impacted. So young New Zealanders will need to be set up with the skills needed for a future, and workers that might be affected by business closures will need to be supported and upskilled. So a lot of work in front of us, but I'm sure all of you have some wonderful ideas and challenges to share with us to contribute towards our thinking. So I will hand back to you, Carly.
Kia ora, thank you both, that was great. We've just got a couple of questions through, so before we move on to school strike, I'll ask you guys a question actually, Ethan and Kelly. This is quite topical because I know we were going to talk about it later on in the session, but what needs to be done about climate change and biodiversity education in our schools? It'd be good to hear your thoughts.
Awesome, yeah, I'm happy to answer this one, and Kelly can add on to it if you like. So obviously, from a school strikes perspective, we're demanding that climate change be taken more seriously within the education sector. We've seen that it's easily been able to slip through the cracks. You know, from my perspective at school, there are climate education standards out there, but teachers have the opportunity to teach that or not. So we need to be making sure that those standards are more compulsory. We want to make sure that this involves teaching basic foundations of science behind climate change, as well as the economical and social impacts of it. We believe that such topics need to also be taught in a te ao Māori perspective, so that students are able to understand the social and cultural impacts the crisis that we face is having. We also believe that it's necessary that such teaching needs to include the current international and domestic state of climate policy and agreements. So that could look like the Paris Agreement, the Zero Carbon Act, the emissions trading scheme. There's so much out there that can be taught, but it just isn't being taught at the moment. So obviously this type of policy from the government needs to include compulsory climate standards within public and state integrated schools. So that can be stretching from year 1 to 10, but also being able to look at where it can fit and be integrated into NCEA level subjects such as geography, English, history, biology. Because at the end of the day, we all know that education is the crucial step to ensuring that the people of Aotearoa are aware and understand the societal issues such as climate change. It has been able to guide us to where we stand and where we are today. And by allowing and encouraging the open knowledge and impacts of climate change, we'll definitely be able to set up the youth of today, as well as future generations, to fight and address the climate crisis that we face today. So it's really important that we're being able to roll out the policy of climate education, but not only for us school students or the future school students to come that are able to join this movement and give them that opportunity, but like I said earlier, stretching it out to our wider communities and the generations that we have today, because it's not a matter of responding to this crisis in a few years from now. It's the time to act is now, and we're all acknowledging that today. So we need to be able to make sure that all generations are aware of this and have all hands on deck.
Thanks, Ethan, that was great. We have a few more questions, but I think I'll hand over to you guys to talk a bit more about why you think the work of the Commission's important before we break for some more questions. How does that sound?
Awesome, yeah. I've got, I think Kelly and I were talking. Kelly, do you want to talk about school strike?
Yeah, so just for anyone who doesn't know about us, School Strike for Climate is made up of school students aged 8 to 18. We live all up and down the country from Tamaki Makaurau down to Invercargill. So we're not an organisation because we're not that organised. We call ourselves a group. And our main action are our school strikes. So we held 3 in 2019, and we hope to be more active this year, COVID permitting. So I think one thing that makes school strike so special is that we've all got our different reasons for joining. We've all got our different whys, but we unite under this, like, for this fight for climate justice. I think that's about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then going back to Charlie's question, sort of for us, why it's so important for young people to think about the work of the Commission, because at the end of the day, and especially at the current point in time we have with the report just recently being released, it is the Commission that are ultimately putting in the hard yards to provide the rollout of not only climate policy, but a fair response to the current crisis that we're facing. As a young person, I feel we have an obligation to remain engaged and to keep and continue asking questions, and to be able to hold the government to account. Because ultimately it is our generation and future generations that will be hit with the realities of this crisis. So why wouldn't we be wanting to find ways to educate ourselves on the work of the Commission, especially when such work and such report that's been released is quite literally shaping the way of our future. But I also see it as an opportunity for our voices to be heard. Coming from a school strike perspective, we need to be making sure that we take grip of any opportunity or avenue to demand action from central government. And that's definitely something that I think the Commission is able to offer, and we're all able to take advantage of that and demand that action is taken.
Thank you both, that was great. We have actually just got a quick poll that we wanted to share. Amy, if you don't mind launching that. Just bear with us a second. There we go. So we just want to know, do you feel your voice is valued and listened to by government when it comes to climate change? We'll let it, if you have like a minute or so to vote, and then we can have a look at that. That'd be really great. It's good to see so many people voting. Okay, yeah, so it looks like most of you are feeling like your voice is heard, but that the government could do more. And quite a lot of you are still feeling that it's hard to make your views heard. And that's really interesting and probably not that surprising. But this does relate to our advice report. We have a recommendation which actually links to this. So we recommend that government establish processes for incorporating the views of all New Zealanders, which is really important. So this would look like potentially developing new and effective ways of incorporating everyone's views when government look at how to prioritise climate actions and policies over the next 30 years. So climate change impacts everyone, and that's why our advice is out for consultation. We really want this to be an inclusive process. So Ethan and Kelly, it'd be good to hear how you think we could incorporate the views of young people. One possible way we've mentioned in our recommendation is by establishing an ongoing public forum for climate change to bring forward the views and perspectives of all New Zealanders. What do you think about that?
Kelly, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, so I think that'd be an awesome idea that would make it more accessible for young people to get into climate change. I think that it's important to realise that not all young people are as invested in this issue as we are. Even in Wellington, you know, there's lots of people who just honestly have no clue about it. So I think it'd be really good for us to approach them rather than to wait for them to come and give their ideas to us, because I think, like I said, a lot of people just really aren't invested in this issue. And I think we get a lot of support because we're also young and they see that they can relate to us, but you know, really just don't know much. So I think it'd be really, really useful for you guys to talk to young people, you know, approach them rather than to wait for them to approach you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that as well. Being able to, you know, talk to students in high schools, for instance, and actually being able to, like Kelly said, approach them, because a lot are, I know I've spoken to a few students at my school myself, a lot of them aren't sure that they have all the facts and all the knowledge, so therefore they are frightened to speak up. They're afraid that what they're going to say will make them feel stupid or make them feel like they're not good enough to be able to, for instance, submit their opinions and their voices. So being able to make it clear to them that any voice or any input or any life experience you are able to contribute to this is definitely vital. You know, again, it's an intergenerational movement. It's so widespread. It affects all of us. So we need to be able to be making sure that those directly impacted as well as those not directly impacted, their voices are heard, and that we're getting a wide range of perspectives involved.
Yeah, and I think this relates to our demand about climate education. You know, how important it is that we're educated about the facts of this issue so that we, you know, can provide feedback and can submit. And yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That probably does lead us quite nicely onto our section about your key demands. We have got a few questions, so if we move on to the demands now, we can leave more time for questions at the end. So it'd be good to get to some of these. So I asked School Strike for Climate to share their top issues with us, and they sent through 6 of their demands for the government in terms of climate change. So I'll read the 6 of them now, but we're only going to have time to focus on a couple today. I think we'll maybe start with 1 or 2, Kelly and Ethan, if that's all good, and then we'll see what time we get to move on to the others. So the six issues are climate education in schools, which we've already touched on a little bit, investing in a just transition, investing and implementing 100% renewable energy, phasing out the use of fossil fuels nationwide, government honouring its responsibility to our Pacific Island neighbours, and agricultural emissions. And since we've already touched on climate education in schools a little bit, are you happy for us to move on to the just transition first? Or yeah, okay, all good. So it'd be good to hear from you a bit more about that demand and what your thoughts are for that before I throw it back to Rod and Lisa to respond.
Yeah, cool. So this demand for us specifically entails investing in retraining and upskilling workers in unsustainable industries. We want to provide a range of clean, green jobs for all New Zealanders and support the process of economic transition through investments and support programs in areas reliant on high emission sectors for them to feel comfortable in the transition. And we also want to invest in green infrastructure projects to further green jobs. And so this leads quite well into our value of climate justice. So we want to ensure that in the move towards a more sustainable economy, we're not leaving anybody behind. I think it's really important to remember that while shutting down a coal mine is a good move towards a green society, it's detrimental to the thousands of people who are losing their jobs. And so at School Strike, we want to ensure that we retrain these workers into more sustainable industries.
Rod and Lisa, do you have any thoughts on that? Oh, sorry, Rod, you're on mute. Thank you.
Okay, Lisa, I think you should go first. I'll come in after you.
I support what you have just outlined, Kelly. I come from a rural community. All of the industries that drive our economy here are the industries that are going to be impacted upon: mining, as I said earlier, agriculture, forestry, tourism, and what we can't end up with is a ghost town or a whole lot of little ghost towns on the west coast, which is potentially where we will head, you know. So I agree, but we have to have a sound transition plan to shift communities from one state to another, because if we don't, we're going to increase existing inequities within these communities. So I agree, in education, whether that be within our schools or in our, you know, on the West Coast, it's a polytech, we have to start thinking about how we all shift as a community.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. That was great. Did you have anything to add, Rod, or are you happy for us to move on to the next one?
Yeah, I think the thing to remember is often it's quite easy to identify when economies are changing whether jobs are being lost, and it's much harder to identify whether new jobs are being created. There's actually lots of work to be done to move from our high emitting economy and society to a low emissions one. So there's no shortage of work to be done. And I think what Lisa and Kelly are identifying is sometimes where the work is currently being done may not naturally be where the new work that needs to be done will occur. And that's where the just transition has the opportunity to nudge and push where the new work needs to be done into the areas where maybe there will be excess skills and capability. So the classic one is to think a little bit about Southland, where we've got a lot of electricity currently being used to make aluminium, which is sent overseas. That electricity is going to become available. The good people in Southland would rather it stayed in the south and was used to create replacement jobs for the 1,000 jobs at the smelter. But the wider national interest may be that power is made available to all of New Zealand to decarbonise ground transportation. But that shouldn't be where the conversation ends. The conversation should go on and say, but there are some things happening in Southland which should be thoroughly investigated as opportunities. The forecast for climate is it's going to get windier down in Southland. So what about wind farms? There's no doubt there's a large amount of biomass in Southland. What about a biofuels economy that can be developed there? So I think that the idea that we've got new industries which are going to be built and we have choices about where they might be built is actually very important for thinking about lives and livelihoods and communities. The Commission's advice that we establish 25,000 hectares of new native forests every year from 2030 for decades ahead is going to create a new industry in the propagation, planting, protection, pest control and management of new native forests. That's $500 million to $1 billion a year, largely of labour, which is going to be needed largely in provincial and rural New Zealand. So again, we can see the jobs that might be lost in the gas industry, the petrol distribution sector, but we need also to begin to identify where the new opportunities are and where the new skills will be required. And as you guys rightly said, that's where we need to direct the education and training dollars as well. The electrification of everything is going to require substantially new skills, and many of them in electricity generation, transmission, and the plug-in of whether it's EVs or heat pumps or solar arrays or wind turbines. So again, new opportunities as well, but they won't always naturally be where the current communities are. And that's the challenge of a just transition, that it happens at a pace that doesn't lead to excessive windfall gains for some lucky people and communities and some unavoidable burdens for other individuals and communities. But we have it in our power to manage this appropriately. We just have to choose to do it.
Thank you, that was great, really interesting. Before we move on to one of the other demands, I think I'll ask a question or two just to make sure we are getting people's questions asked live, because we're having some really great conversation coming through in the chat and in the questions. So thank you to everyone, it's really interesting to see. So I'll just ask this one first from Elena, who's asked a couple of questions. Thank you, Elena. I'm thinking that engagement with youth could perhaps be more successful using a partnership between the Climate Change Commission and youth leaders. For example, youth-to-youth engagement supported by the Climate Change Commission. What are your thoughts? I'll throw that to Ethan and Kelly first, and then back to Rod and Lisa.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I feel like that would be really beneficial because, we've seen today we've got 60 participants. And that was from obviously being able to get on board with you guys over at the Commission. And I think for a lot of young people, when you see things like school strike, it's great to be able to be part of because you've got similar like-minded students, but at the same time you also need to be able to be talking with the professionals on this one. So being able to invite youth leaders and invite the commission and invite the scientists to have a discussion like this is really valuable. And I think that that could definitely support the movement and also be able to show that, again, this is an intergenerational movement, and it is one that should be putting more pressure on the government. So if you're seeing the scientists and the young people and those most impacted by this crisis come together and have a kōrero like this, it's definitely going to send a clear message to the government that we're all here and we're just waiting for the action to be made.
Thank you. Rod or Lisa, do you have any further comments?
Look, the Climate Change Commission is in an interesting position. Obviously, we receive taxpayer funding. That's what we get given. And we're given a mandate, or that is a mission, which we are required to do. We have yet to find any agency that is actually funded and mandated, that is tasked to do climate education. So we're not resourced to do it. We need to do the education in order to be effective in seeking consultation. But the outreach and education is not something that we are either being tasked or funded to do. And I think that's a legitimate question that Ethan has raised, is so where in the system do you get the evidence base about human impact on the environment, and in particular on climate, and what policy actions and choices that can be taken? And that's a challenge, but it's a good challenge to put in front of government. I think there's also the opportunity for clever activists to get leverage from drawing public attention to specific opportunities to make a difference. So I think School Strike has been able to raise the profile in middle-aged people about an issue that largely seem to be distant from their everyday lives. When you're facing the challenge of getting to work, getting the kids out the door to school, trying to figure out how to look after your aging parents, and then along comes this other big looming but not immediately in your face issue. I think School Strike and other activist groups have done an incredible job in the last decade in mainstreaming public awareness and willingness to consider taking action. We couldn't have been having this conversation 10 years ago. We should have been, but there wouldn't have been the willingness in our elected leaders or the support from wider New Zealand to make some of the changes that are now being made. Don't take your foot off the pedal.
Thank you, that's great. We've just had one through from Connor, which is topical as well. I'll throw this out to Kelly maybe first. Could School Strike for Climate talk a bit more about climate change education and the current issues that students experience trying to access it, and what they think specifically needs to change?
Yeah, so I found that climate education exists from about year 1 to year 8. Once you hit secondary school, it's just gone. Because I think we've got the resources, well, limited resources, but teachers don't have to teach it. So because of that, we're losing a lot of it in secondary school education. And that's something that we specifically want to push, because I think that's when people are becoming more aware of this issue, becoming more aware of the significance of climate change. Sorry, hold on a minute, I'm just going to read the rest of that question.
Sorry, I can read it again. I think it's just gone into the answer box. But so it's the difficulties that you have and what you think specifically needs to change. Yeah.
So as Ethan had talked about earlier, it really needs to be taught from the Te Ao Māori perspective, because that's again what we're lacking a lot of. I think when we do learn about climate change, it's more about global warming. So we learn about the sciences behind it, which is incredibly important, but I think we lack a lot of the social justice issues around it. So that's what we would want to push.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and that reflects a lot of what people are saying in the chat as well, actually. Mataranga Māori should be informing all aspects of climate education. Did you have any thoughts on that, Lisa or Rod? Or Lisa, would you like to respond? Or
Well, we're using it to inform our thinking, you know, and it's an absolute must that we do that. I think there are lots of things we can learn from mātauranga Māori and across all aspects, whether that's the environment or whether we're talking about a social issue. So look, I could ramble on about education in our schools as an iwi who've been trying to get change for a number of years. We do have to get more specific and targeted about what's ahead of us in the future. And the only way I think we're going to get to that change is, as Rod said, keep doing what you're doing. Keep ensuring that your voices are coming through many different mediums.
I think the other thing I would observe, because I was essentially brought up in the old mainstream monoculture of New Zealand white, is there is a huge body of knowledge in Te Ao Māori about how you live with your environment rather than seek to dominate it. And I think for 150 years, because we haven't either known or cared about the impacts we've had on the environment, we have literally sought to dominate it, to put rivers into pipes, to put diverse bio environments into monocultures because we could reap and sow and harvest. For a time, I don't think we really knew how much damage we were doing, but that time is well past. That if the human species is going to live and prosper in the centuries to come, we need to learn how to live in and live with our environment, not merely to dominate it. The fossil fuel technology was the most extraordinary technology to have developed. You know, a single barrel of oil is estimated to do 10,000 labor hours of work for $45 US, about 60 New Zealand dollars. It's extraordinarily potent as a source of energy. But the reality is that the way we burn it in the open air will poison us and all the life around us. So we need to stop doing that, and we need to stop doing it quite quickly. And in order to protect and preserve our way of life, we need to find alternatives. And fortunately for us, there are alternatives, but we have to choose to adopt them, and we have to choose to do that quite rapidly, and we have to do that on a global scale. So, you know, it is the case that this doesn't willingly want to give up what we've got as outcomes. It needs to be more equitable to be more viable, and it needs to have a lot less impact on our environment. So the agenda here is very, very rapidly, as we became fixed with the knowledge more broadly of what we're doing and how quickly it is now going to make things worse if we don't act in ways that we have identified we can. So that's the optimistic story, is we can do this, and there is no longer an excuse for not doing it.
Yeah, I agree with that one, Rod and Lisa. And going back to what Kelly was saying about our experiences of how we faced climate educations in high school, and the reality is it's not there. For me, all I was taught was global warming, and that was in primary and intermediate, and then moving to high school. There is the opportunity to learn about it in subjects such as social studies, but teachers are choosing not to teach it. And that may be for various reasons. For instance, they simply don't have the education themselves for them to be able to teach it, or simply because it's not of interest to them and it's something they're not passionate about, therefore they're not going to be teaching it to students. And I think this is the lack that we're also experiencing in other areas. For instance, if we're looking at New Zealand history, you know, we're being taught about the Treaty of Waitangi rather than Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And that's where we face a huge lack. We need to start being taught about the realities of this, because there's so much information out there, and majority of our school strikers are being taught about this crisis online via news articles, social media. And from that, you get a lot of misguided rumors rather than the science-based facts. And that's when we start having controversy over what climate change is. Is it a myth? Is it the fact? So being able to implement real climate education with the science-based facts and the cultural and societal issues that follow with it will definitely be able to set us up for a much easier and a much more stable approach to this crisis and how we're going to be able to respond to it.
Thank you all, that was great. Since we're having so many great questions, which obviously shows how important this is to people and discussion, Ethan has agreed that we can carry on with the questions and rather than going through all of the issues or demands, but I'm sure that they can point us to some more resource on their social channels, etc., where they talk more about those demands, so people can check those out offline. So I'll just ask another question now. We've got 10 minutes to go, so we'll try and get through one or two more if we can, but it's, as I said, it's really fantastic to see so many comments and it shows how interested everyone is. So we've got one here from Brianna. Lots of people think that a zero carbon future is expensive as there is a lot of infrastructure that needs to be in place. How can a zero carbon future become more accessible to all New Zealanders? School strike, I don't know if you, Ethan or Kelly, want to have a go at your thoughts on this before we pass over to the Commission.
Over to Kelly if you want to have a go.
Yeah, sorry, lunchtime has just started. I hope you can still hear me. So I think that what we need to realise is that these infrastructure zero carbon projects, they're going to be expensive upfront, but in the future it's going to be a lot cheaper. So if, for example, we can use EVs, right? They're probably going to be more expensive than petrol-powered cars at the moment, but in the future, it's actually saving you money. So I think we need to, invest in more of those projects, and then educate people about how they're actually going to help in the future.
Yeah, I'll add on to that, and I think we do need to see a huge step up and actually leadership from the government to say the time to transition is now. So we need to be seeing the funding and the investing and the subsidizing of cleaner energies. We know that whānau and, those within the wider community aren't able to afford it. Living in Oamaru, there are very little solar paneled houses. I don't see an electric car on a daily basis like we should be seeing. So the support from the government needs to be there, and we need to start seeing subsidizing of those cleaner energies to be able to, show stability for the wider community to be able to use those cleaner energy resources. And then that's when we'll be able to start seeing the transition into more sustainable pathways.
Lisa or Rod, do you have anything to add?
Let me just add a bit that the Commission's estimate is that New Zealand's gross domestic product, which is a measure of the money value of busyness in our economy, is expected to grow by about 75% between now and 2050 if we don't take the emissions reduction pathway that we are advising. And if we do take the pathway, we're estimating gross domestic product, instead of growing by 75% over the next 30 years, will grow by 74%. Now, between you and me, for some people, this is disappointing that it is so affordable, because they liked hiding behind the idea that it was all going to be very expensive and we couldn't afford to do this. And in some cases, that was a smokescreen for, I want my vested interest to be protected because you can't afford to make the change. Turns out that is not true. It turns out that a lot of our long-lived assets will reach the end of their natural life and then be replaced by low-emission technology. I'll give you one example. The Huntly Power Station has coal and gas-fired boilers. Our advice is that by 2030, so in some people's minds too long, in other people's minds too soon, we should no longer be burning coal to create baseload electricity. It's an old boiler anyway, for goodness sake. So they're going to have to turn it off. And the alternative will either be electricity generated from renewable sources, such as wind or solar, or gains from energy efficiency. But the GDP impact of turning off that boiler is nil. In the same way we say that we need to stop burning coal in food processing by 2037. And some people will say that's too soon and some will say that's too far. But basically there are 200 big coal-fired boilers in New Zealand. We know where they are. We know who owns them, that use coal to make a profit. And yes, the alternative might be more expensive, and occasionally that business might not even survive, but they should not have the right to burn coal. But the pathway the Commission is outlining says just when it gets to the end of its life, don't replace it with a new coal boiler. And by the way, from 2025, don't install any new ones. So the transition cost can be much higher if we delay and have to do this hard and fast later. It's already a little more expensive than it might have been because we've waited, but equally waiting has given us some new technologies, much better wind turbines, much better batteries for EVs. So there has been some modest advantage in delay in terms of the technologies, but quite a lot of lost time in terms of the action we now need to take. Delay is no longer a good option.
Thank you, Rod. That was great. And we've literally got 4 minutes, but I want to ask one more question before we close for Karakia. And as I said before, there's been some amazing questions coming through. I'm really sorry we couldn't get through all of them, but do please make a submission and write your thoughts or ideas to us during consultation. I'll post the link to our consultation site in the chat in a second. And so we've just had one in from Sophie. How do you see climate justice as being different from climate action? Ethan and Lisa, maybe if you want to have a go at just responding to that one while we've got the last couple of minutes. I know it's keeping it brief, but...
Yeah, I'm happy to start that one off. So obviously, kia ora, Sophie. Climate justice, I feel, is the obligation that we hold for not only everyday New Zealanders, but for our Pacific Island neighbours, for Indigenous communities. We need to be aligning all of our climate policy with Te Tiriti o Waitangi and respecting our Pacific Island neighbours in the process. The main argument I see in every day is that New Zealand is too small. What can we do? We can't make a difference. And for me, that's just simply not good enough, because we see the impacts that we are having on other islands, where they are literally being submerged within the Pacific Ocean. And that is because of the emissions that we're emitting. You know, it may not just be us, of course it's other countries, but we also have a huge part in that. And ultimately, I believe that New Zealand can be a country where we can lead the way of change. You know, we are small, but we've seen, you know, throughout the COVID period that we can be a country that leads the way for other nations. So being able to say that enough is enough on a global scale, and actually take that step forward to introducing real ambitious climate policy is definitely going to show attraction from other nations. And then we are going to be able to be showing that climate justice, that we are standing up towards our obligations and making sure that we have a fair response for everyone across Aotearoa and obviously the Pacific Ocean.
I think I like to think of it, sorry, just something quick, as climate justice being the goal and climate action being how we get there. So yeah, that's
awesome. Yeah. Lisa, do you have any closing comments?
No, just if you then take what Ethan has said and then scale it down to how we behave inside of Aotearoa in terms of different minority ethnicities, rural communities, the difference in deprivation level, etc., and then how we as a society actually take the right action to ensure we're taking a better care of our population than what we currently are. So there's a lot of obligations, and this isn't all the Climate Commission. This is everybody. We're all in this together. This is business industry. This is all walks of life, all parts of society. This is iwi taking a lead for their people to ensure that we don't create power poverty. We're hearing a lot of talk about power poverty. So as we move forward, we've got to ensure that our decision making, that we're thinking ethically, that we're doing the right things for our communities, all parts of our communities.
Thank you all, that was amazing, and thanks again for taking the time out of your day. We've had some really positive feedback and comments in the chat, which I can share with the team afterwards. So unfortunately we are at 1 o'clock now, so I'm just going to hand over to Bevan for a closing karakia, but also an inspiring conversation today. Thank you.
Kia ora tātou, tēnā koutou mua koutou tini whakaaro me ngā awhina I tukua mai hei tautoko I tā tātou zui me te kaupapa nei. So thank you all for your views, your questions, your interactions, your time invested in this kaupapa. Anei he karakia whakamutunga. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te ata whae o tō tātou ariki a ihu karauti me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga o te wairua tapu ake a mene. Kia ora.